So Smithfield Plantation was built between 1772 and 1774. It was the most important house in southwestern Virginia, and it was the home to the Preston family, which we'll see their home in just a moment, which was made significant contributions to American politics and higher education. Virginia Tech now sits on the land that was once Smithfield, and here influential people discuss topics like American independence relations with Native peoples, Western exploration, slavery and abolition, and Civil War, and more. Here, generations of enslaved Africans worked, lived, and died. Enslaved people formed vibrant families and communities of their own, and their involuntary work made the achievements of the Preston family possible. Today, Smithfield remains as the best example of colonial-era architecture west of the Blue Ridge and uses the stories of the Preston family, the enslaved community, and indigenous peoples to share the values of courage, leadership, and education. And here we can see where Smithfield Plantation is located. And so, and the image of the front. And so, you know, it's really very close to Roanoke, right, Ryan? So it's just a hop and a skip, really. And
yeah,
so
very close.
If you haven't been, I encourage you to visit, and we'll talk about the hours at the end of this tour as well. So Ryan is the executive director of Preston Smithfield in Blacksburg, Virginia, where he lives with his wife, Julia, a fellow historian. And before working at Smithfield, Ryan spent 13 years at the Henry Ford in Dearborn, Michigan, where he served in several roles, including general manager of Greenfield Village. Ryan is a graduate of the University of St. Andrews, Scotland, with a Master's of Letters in Museum Studies, and Hillsdale College in Michigan with a BA in History, Literature, and Education. Ryan graduated from AASLH's History Leadership Institute in 2012, and currently is involved with Greek Crew at Virginia Tech, Rotary International, and supporting LGBTQ Christians Church. And we have also joined by Kenna Jewell. So we're, which we have the staff from the Taubman visited Smithfield and took video that'll be included in the exhibition, not only of the blacksmith in action, but also of Kenna. And I know that you did a quill pen demo, so we're excited to be able to share that as well. Kenna received her bachelor's degree in art history from Radford University, followed by a master's degree in material culture and public humanities from Virginia Tech. So all here in the region, which is wonderful. And in 2018, Kenna began her current position at Preston Smithfield as operations manager, where she supervises daily museum operations, special events, educational programs, and serves as the staff and volunteer coordinator. So as we know in a nonprofit, many hats that we all wear. So welcome, Ryan and Kenna. We're so excited to be able to collaborate on this exhibition, both on site and virtually like today. And we'll go ahead and screen share then of that inspiration of the exhibition. We showed a George Washington exhibition in 2016. It was most popular with our community, with our schools. And so having an opportunity to do a spotlight now, especially during this virtual time frame where schools can't come in for tours, we're going to be able to share that virtually of George Washington. And here, I know many of you on the call this evening were able to see the fabulous works, and a number of these will be included from a private collection in this current spotlight. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Carl Willers, who is our Chief Curator and Deputy Director of Exhibitions and Community Engagement here at the museum. And he will share a little bit about what's going to be on view in this exhibition from the George Washington side. And then I'll hand it over to Ryan, and we'll screen share a number of objects that will be on view from Smithfield Plantation. Carl?
A. Alt A. Can people hear me?
Yes.
Okay. What you see here on your screen is a portrait of George Washington at Yorktown by Charles Wilson Peale, an American artist, lived from 1741 to 1827. This is a three-quarter pose replica of a full-length portrait painted by Charles Wilson Peale in 1779. And this is one of 25 copies that Peale produced for clients in America and Europe. Peale painted George Washington well over 100 times during his life. And this rendition was commissioned by the Count de Rochambeau for his home in France. Rochambeau lent his forces to Washington in what was to become the decisive battle of the American Revolution at Yorktown. Washington's depicted in the current military fashion of the times and is also the only copy to depict Yorktown in the background. It could be speculated that Rochambeau asked Peale to depict Yorktown in order to commemorate the friendship between himself and Washington. As you can see, it's 50 by 40 inches. So literally a life-size scale portrait of Washington. This is a portrait miniature. And actually the first portrait of Washington made as President of the United States. It's by John Ramage, who's Irish artist, who lived from 1748 to 1802. It's actually dated as a portrait from October 3rd, 1789, which is pretty interesting. It is a watercolor on ivory, and this delicate miniature portrait of George Washington was painted on ivory, as he said, October 3rd, 1789. Ramage was the first artist to depict him while he was serving as President of the United States, and presents Washington wearing military dress. The portrait commissioned by Washington was given to his wife, the First Lady, Martha Dandridge Custis Washington. And the back of the locket, which you also, you see the reverse side here in the picture. On the back of the locket displays a braided lock of Washington's hair overlaid with his initials, an inset in a gold rim engraved with the history of ownership. Ramage paints Washington with a contemplative expression, a fresh contrast to his more traditional austere expressions depicted in other portraits. Also interesting to note is that Washington is wearing the blue ribbon denoting his membership in the Society of the Cincinnati, a fraternal association of Continental Army officers. Washington was the society's first president. And yes, we can move on to this. This is one of two gouaches by Louise Nicolas van Blerenberg, a French artist who lived from 1716 to 1794. This is actually the Siege of Yorktown. There's another companion painting which shows the surrender at Yorktown. The Siege of Yorktown that you see here was painted in 1786, which is also the date that we have for the surrender of Yorktown. There are both gouaches. They're about 23 by 37 inches. And these very meticulously rendered watercolors or gouaches depict the siege and surrender of Yorktown during the American Revolutionary War. British troops lost to American and French forces at Yorktown, Virginia, a development that effectively ended the war. Jean-Baptiste Donatien de Vimour, better known as the Count de Rochambeau, worked alongside General George Washington to defeat the British. Louis Nicolas van Blerenberg painted both scenes in Paris in 1785, and actually I think 1786, excuse me, and was likely based on sketches by a draftsman named Charles Louis Berthier, who served under the French General Rochambeau and was an eyewitness to the siege and surrender. Berthier's sketches were sent to the French court, where they were available to Van Blarenburg. French King Louis XVI personally commissioned the two paintings to give to General Rochambeau, who then displayed them in his chateau for several years. In the paintings, Van Blarenburg meticulously illustrates hundreds of individual figures, and you can take a closer look when they're on view here at the museum to see the exquisite detail of the hundreds of vignettes depicted in this battle scenes.
We're going to go ahead and hand it over to Ryan. We've got a couple of items that will be in the exhibition from Smithfield, and then we're going to start at the house tour in the main passage. Ryan?
Yeah, so we will highlight those in just a little bit, but we have an invitation actually from George Washington to one of Colonel William Preston's children, and we'll get a little bit more into that in a little bit. And we also have a gift that Colonel William Preston gave or received from George Washington as a thank you, as a token of appreciation. So we'll get into both of those in just a little bit, and we're so excited to show them to you. And we're really excited they're going to be at the Taubman.
Wonderful, thank you. So we're in the main passage now, is that correct?
That's correct. So when you were a guest to Colonel William Smithfield, you would have come in from this direction. This would have been the main hallway where you would have been received. So we like to use this as kind of a welcome and orientation to the space. We do have in here a number of timelines and maps to kind of give an idea of what Smithfield was. Really, as Cindy said earlier, Smithfield did incorporate everything that is now Virginia Tech. So it was very large, it took up a lot of space. But this is also a location where we try to introduce the idea that we're talking about history, sure, but we're talking about things that matter even in 2020, things like courage, leadership, and education. Those are three themes that we're going to hit very hard throughout the whole tour. And it's also a spot where we introduce the idea that there were more than just the Prestons here. We want to use the story of the indigenous peoples who are here, the Monacan, the Shawnee, but also over 200 enslaved people who were here between the years 1774, 75 and 1865, when the Civil War ended and the 13th Amendment became ratified. But we're going to focus on one little artifact here, and I'm going to turn it over to Kenna to talk about that. This is a portrait.
I'm going to turn you around real quick so you can see Miss Susanna Smith Preston. Susanna's portrait is right here in the main entryway. And like Ryan was saying, you're introduced to Preston characters as soon as you enter the home. And Susanna's here to greet you as she might have been if you had been a visitor back in 1774. So Susanna Smith Preston was a really amazing woman. She married Colonel William Preston. And not only did she have 12 children, 11 of which lived into adulthood, she also was formidable and courageous and moved down here to Smithfield when it was constructed in 1774, when she was pregnant with her 8th child, James Patton Preston. And she was essentially moving out here to the unknown frontier. She had to be very brave and very courageous to do that and to be able to raise her family out here by herself. After Colonel William died in 1783, Susanna ran the plantation for 40 years after his death, which is something that women were not very usually tasked with at that point in history. So she is one of our favorite heroes in this house and on this tour. Yeah, and I want to show you also, we mentioned her 8th child. This is James Patton Preston. He is the first child to be born here at Smithfield. He's the 8th child of the family, actually born on Ryan's birthday. Ryan and James share a birthday, a couple hundred years apart. But James was a very interesting man as well. Not only did he serve in the War of 1812, he also became a governor of Virginia a little bit later. And then he would come back here to Smithfield, and Smithfield would be his homestead for the rest of his life. And then eventually he would pass it to his sons to continue that homestead.
Okay, so we're going to now move from the passage to the drawing room. So I'll invite you over here. The lighting is a little dim, but we did that on purpose. We want you to get an idea of maybe what it would have looked like if you were staying here as a guest to the Prestons in the late 1700s. If you were a guest to the Prestons, you would have been welcomed to a couple of tables. Women typically would have sat up here in front, and men would have sat towards the back. This is an area where you would have had an enslaved person serving, tending fire, making sure that all the guests were comfortable. And this would have been a spot where anybody who was interested in doing business in southwestern Virginia would have come, because Colonel William Preston was a surveyor, and he was responsible for surveying tracts of land further west into Fincastle County, and also what became Kentucky later on. So anybody moving west, including my family, my progenitors, came through Montgomery County, which is really, really cool. I discovered that later, and settled into eastern Kentucky about 200 years ago. So it's very possible that they would have been connected with Smithfield in one way or another. This home is very unique for this time and this part of the country. This is the best example of colonial architecture west of Blue Ridge Mountains. If you visited Colonial Williamsburg and you came to Smithfield, you would see a lot of similarities. And that's because Colonel William Preston wanted this home to be built as a billboard for the future of southwestern Virginia. He wanted to show that this was a place where you're not going to always live in log structures, and that's mostly what was here, but you could live in relative comfort and ease. And he actually was a member of the House of Burgesses with George Washington in Williamsburg, where he was really, really inspired by the architecture. And we're going to focus on one piece here that really connects to Colonial Williamsburg.
So as Ryan mentioned, that's too bright. I'll just get a little bit closer. It's kind of dark in here, but we want to show you this fireplace surround in this drawing room. And this is a main focal point. As soon as you enter the room, you see it. Not only is it really beautifully colored and painted, it's also very, very tall. It's probably about 7 feet tall, or 8 feet tall. This particular fireplace surround might look familiar to those of you who have been to Colonial Williamsburg at some point in your life. This particular design came straight from Raleigh Tavern in Williamsburg. As Ryan just mentioned, William Preston spent time in the House of Burgesses for a few sessions, and so he would have been really well acquainted with colonial design and architecture. And as in making Smithfield the billboard for the southwestern Virginia region, he wanted to bring those elements of design back here to his home. And so he took the fireplace design and put it in his own drawing room. So people who were visiting him would be able to see this opulence and this wealth here in southwestern Virginia and think maybe they could potentially find some sort of same good fortune here. And it's actually interesting, when Raleigh Tavern did burn in the early 1900s, when they were restoring that building, they came here to Smithfield to look at this particular fireplace around. So it is now the original design, which we are very proud of.
And we're going to go ahead and screen share the, we have an image of what you just talked about, the at Raleigh Tavern in Williamsburg, and side by side so you can see that. There we're showing in the tavern in Williamsburg and the room, and you can see to the left at the end of the space in that dining room. And then this side by side with Smithfield Plantation on the left and Raleigh Tavern on the right. Wonderful.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I love seeing those side by side. One of the key character traits that we talk about in this room is courage. And whenever a guest goes through this room, we ask them to answer a question and write it on a leaf. And we'll talk about that in just a little while. But the question is, where and when have you shown courage? As Kenna mentioned, it took a huge amount of courage for the Preston family to move here from Greenfield, because this really was on the edge of the frontier. But it also took a huge amount of courage for the enslaved community to live day in and day out. They had no idea how long they would be here in Smithfield. We do know a number of occasions when families were divided, when the population was sold and decreased and increased and then decreased again. So just living, existing would have required a huge amount of courage. So we're going to start heading up to the children's room. If you want to follow me.
And we're heading up the stairs, is that correct?
Yes, we are. And as we head up the stairs, you will notice right here a very ornate design that is a Chippendale influence. Chippendale, of course, was a very popular design in the latter part of the 18th century. And this just shows that Colonel William Preston would have been very aware of what was stylish, and he wanted to show that he was knowledgeable of current design. We are upstairs now, and before we get into the children's room, I wanted to point out this landing. This landing is just a little place between two fairly large rooms. As I mentioned, the Prestons had a good number of children. A lot of them were adults by the time this house was built, but anybody who came here with children had their children stay here in this house. And in this little spot right here, an enslaved woman would have slept. And she would have slept so that she could tend to the needs of the girls who stayed in the room to my left, and we'll go into that room in a little bit, and the boys who slept in the room over to my right. It's really interesting to consider what it would have been like caring for children who were not yours, while not knowing whether or not your own children would be safe or even be with you. I have a lot of respect and admiration for the number of people who served as nanny here in this place. And so we like to try to add a name and a face as much as we can to each place. So we identified one enslaved woman who was named Nanny, and we say that this might be a spot where she would have slept. And again, just thinking about what her experience would have been often just brings me to chills. But we will go into the girls' room over here. As I mentioned, this room is where girls would have slept. There were a large number of children who would have come here as guests and stayed here. James Patton Preston certainly would have been a child in this room. And we asked people to consider what their childhood was like and kind of compare and contrast that to maybe what it would have been like to have a large number of guests coming through and staying with you and having perhaps 11 siblings.
Now, as we go down the stairs, Ryan pointed out the Chinese Chippendale staircase design here. But as we come down the stairs into the passage, you might notice the very tall ceilings. This was another piece of architectural design that William Preston put in his frontier home to really show his wealth and to show different pioneers and different visitors to Smithfield that you could have potentially a very large home just like this. And this was in complete contrast to the log cabins that were pretty much common at this time on the frontier.
And right now we are in the master chamber, and we have one of our volunteers here. This is Jess. I'll introduce her in just a little bit, but this room is where Colonel William and Susanna would have slept. And if you were an adult guest, we showed you where children would have stayed, but if you're an adult guest, you would have stayed here as well in this, in a bed like this over here. This room would be very private to most of us, but there was a very different concept of what privacy was in the late 1700s. Sleeping in the same room as your guests might be a little uncomfortable, but we think Susanna was interested in showcasing this room to people who came through. We know that through paint samples that we found, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a little bit. But this was also kind of a corridor, a hallway to the main dining room. So this was designed for people to see. I'll introduce you right now to Jess. She is actually working on a garment. Everything that Jess is wearing, she produced here while working at Smithfield. And I will mention that Jess is wearing a mask. Ken and I are not wearing masks because we are in each other's little bubbles. Most of the time, we are the only people here at Smithfield, but our volunteers and interpretive staff always do wear masks, and when we're open to the public, Ken and I wear masks as well.
So Jessica, can you tell us a little bit about what you're working on and your outfit?
Sure. So this is actually what a petticoat starts to look like. They're technically only, 1 to 2 yards of fabric, and then they are sewn together, and the sides actually become the pocket slits. So pockets were a very big part of a woman's wardrobe, and wardrobes, of course, for women could have many different styles. And from the 1770s, which is when Smithfield, of course, was built, you have a whole range of styles that women got to wear. So I'm actually wearing one of them, which is called a caraco. And this one is a bodice that has an attached skirt. Underneath is a petticoat. And there are multiple petticoats under here that I'm wearing because it's very typical to wear multiple, not just for style and for floof, but also for warmth. And you'll also find that you will have some kind of hip support. And it's not necessarily for the person wearing it, but for the garment, because a lot of these petticoats and a lot of the fabrics are going to be heavy. So instead of weighing down the silhouette, it just fluffs it up a bit.
Well, you look fantastic, Jess. Thank you so much.
Jessica worked very hard on this exact outfit all summer. Ryan and I really got to see it take shape throughout June and July and August, which was really cool. And then she was able to wear it on Halloween to Smithfield. And so we actually got to see it from head to toe, which was a really neat experience for us.
Mm-hmm.
And Ryan and Kenna, how many volunteers or interpreters do you have on at Smithfield at one time when visitors are coming to the plantation?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. We have a total of about 25 people who volunteer here in different capacities, some front of house, some back of house. But usually if it's just an ordinary day, we have 2 volunteers here with us. And Kenna and I are often sitting in one of those positions. We're also chief toilet cleaners. And we take great pride in making sure that the bathrooms here at Smithfield are in top shape.
Some of the other volunteers that we do typically have on site when we're open, we do try to have a blacksmith volunteer on site because we have a forge outside that is a working forge. It is not on the original foundation, but they would have had a forge building here. They would have made that kind of stuff here at Smithfield. So we have really talented craftsmen who are local to Smithfield. Or local to Blacksburg, not to Smithfield. We have about 5 people that kind of rotate through, teach classes with us, and are here throughout our visit season. So that gives people a really great view into what it might have been like here, the sights and sounds and smells, because you can smell the wood smoke as well, of what it would have been like in 1774.
And that's wonderful, because that's really critical to show the whole picture of what it would be like if you walked in the doors.
Absolutely. Ryan mentioned earlier paint samples, and I just want to turn this camera around so you can see the fireplace surround, which you may have caught when we first came into the master chamber. So it's kind of dark in here, but you can really see that rich color blue. This particular paint color is called Prussian blue, and it's a very, very specific and rich color blue. Prussian blue was made as the first synthetic paint in Germany in the 1700s. And because of that, it was extremely expensive. And so the fact that William Preston not only bought it, but painted it in his private bedroom really kind of shows how much wealth he had and was willing to, really willing to spend. If you travel around this way, you can see the different colors in the house. We've got some light blue on the door frames and the wainscoting. We also have a kind of a dusky gray color as well. So William Preston did use this Prussian blue in various ways. He would have mixed the lighter blue here with white paint to make that light blue, and some fireplace ash as well to make the grays. Thank you, Jessica.
No problem.
We are now walking into the dining room. And you'll hear some singers in the background. These are actually the Colonial Williamsburg singers doing Christmas carols that would have been appropriate for the late 18th century. But we want to talk about who would have been in this room. In this room, we know for sure that there would have been all sorts of debates about what to do with indigenous peoples who are here. There were a lot of hostilities between European settlers and indigenous people who are already here. The French and Indian War was still very fresh in people's memory when Smithfield was built. But there was also a lot of discussion about abolition of slavery in this room. We know for sure that there was debate about whether or not slavery should be abolished in the state of Virginia. We know that some of the Prestons were sponsoring a bill that would have ended slavery in Virginia. And we like to think about the enslaved people, what they would have thought overhearing these conversations. When you hear somebody talking about, yes, liberty for all, freedom for all, maybe at some point we'll free everybody, and thinking, I would like that right now. Why am I still working for you when you're talking about freedom and it seems to be important to you. So one of the questions that we ask is about leadership. What is leadership? What does it look like? And when's the time when you've been a leader? So that's one of the questions that we'd like to get people to think about when they're in this room.
So in this room, we have two important portraits here. I'll show this lady first. This is Elizabeth Preston Madison. Elizabeth was the first child and first daughter of William and Susanna. Elizabeth, you can see on the very top of her head, she's got a bonnet on and she has a pair of glasses sitting on top of her head. If you see that in the portraiture of the time, that's usually a symbol that the woman may have needed them, but it's usually a symbol of education. And as Ryan said, the Prestons were very, very committed to their family's education. And this is just one of the ways that Elizabeth was able to show the outside world that she was an educated woman, which is pretty unique for that time period. Elizabeth married into the Madison family and would eventually leave Smithfield and live right down the road in Shawsville. And then right over here on the opposite wall is her brother. This is William Preston Jr. He was the third son, and let me get my shadow out of here. He was the third son of William and Susanna, and he actually is tasked, or he settled Kentucky, an area in Kentucky. And so his line of family went out that way and may have crossed paths with Ryan's family in Kentucky as well.
Well, we've got another set of stairs that we're going to go down, so we just ask that you be very careful. We're heading down into the winter kitchen.
So I'll just give you a quick overview here and then I'll come down and join Ryan.
So this room is the winter kitchen. There would have been a summer kitchen that is no longer standing at Smithfield, but this is where meals would have been prepared during the cooler months. And it's also a finishing kitchen too. So as things were nearly finished outside in the summer kitchen, they might have come in here for a little bit of extra preparation. But this room is really special to Kenna and me, and to those of us who work at Smithfield, because we have this very, very charred lentil. If you take a look at this beam, it's very, very thick. I'm going to allow Kenna to talk about it a little bit more, but this is a strong connection to the enslaved women, more than likely, who would have been cooking in this space.
So I'm going to bring the camera around the side so you can really see how massive this beam is. It is an original piece of Smithfield. And I'll just put my hand up for comparison. So you can see really how large this particular beam is in this fireplace. And as Ryan was saying, it is charred by many, many cooking fires. You can see it's been eaten away by many, many years of use. And if we were to stick our head up underneath here, you'd be able to smell and see all the singed wood over here. And it's very interesting. Sometimes we'll get whiffs of wood smoke in this kitchen as we come down the stairs. This, as Ryan said, this is one of our favorite rooms in the house because you really do feel that tangible connection with actual people who lived here and worked in this very kitchen. And you can really imagine someone in this room.
So we're going to go to another little spot while we're downstairs before we head back up and continue our tour on the main level. This is a downstairs passage that heads over into another space where we display a lot of items connected with archaeological studies and connected with the Preston family. But in this room, we have listed 191 of the enslaved individuals who we know were here at Smithfield. We continue to do research, and we are now over 200 individual enslaved people who are here. We also have a chart that shows the different divisions when families were separated, when the enslaved community was broken up because Susanna died at one point. In 1883, Colonel William dies, and in 1790, a number of his property is divided as well. We also have an apology from the Senate of Virginia. This came out in 2007 at the 400th anniversary of the colony, apologizing for the condition of slavery and also the treatment of indigenous peoples. And right here is a little replica of our Mary tree. There used to be a property here that was really important to the enslaved community. It was a huge, huge oak tree, and it had such strong stories to tell that if anybody who was a descendant from some of the enslaved families came back, they were automatically drawn to that tree. And very sadly, that tree fell in a storm in May this year. But here, we asked people to put their leaves where they answered questions throughout the house. And the question that we asked here is, what is one way you can take a stand against injustice today? And that's something that I would like you to think about now. History is very complicated, just as people are complicated. Colonel William Preston did some amazing things. His children did amazing things. They started institutions of higher learning. They were involved in politics, but still, they owned people. And we see injustices today. And we ask you to think about, sure, there are good things in our society, but there are things that aren't right. And so I just want to invite you to think about some of those things. Store it in your head a little bit. When you come and visit us at Smithfield, I want you to put that on a leaf and tie it to our tree. We're hoping that this will be a record that we'll be able to keep from year over year of what people were thinking at this particular moment in time. And it's been really interesting to read some of those. So we're going to head back upstairs to another really cool room. So this room is actually Colonel William Preston's office, and it's a schoolroom as well. This particular room is where Colonel William Preston would have run his surveying business. He would have worked with indentured servants, European indentured servants, who were apprenticed into becoming surveyors as well. But this is also where he would have done a fair amount of his writing. He would have made sure that his children, all children, whether male or female, were educated here. And often he had the person who was the indentured servant teaching his children. So you can imagine the pressure of having your boss watching you interact with your children. I can't really imagine what that would have been like. And Colonel William Preston also made sure that a number of people from the surrounding area were schooled here too. Before we really get going into a few of the other artifacts in this room, I do want to mention that this house is where Colonel William Preston was living when he wrote letters to George Washington. Colonel William Preston and George Washington had a very strong connection. During the mid-1700s, around 1756, Colonel William Preston and George Washington were involved in a ride through Western Virginia to take a look at different forts and make sure that things were situated securely on the perimeter of the colony, because that was the middle of the French and Indian War. So we wanted to make sure the region was secure. And during that time, they developed a very strong bond. So in 1774 and 75, the two of them wrote back and forth about politics and all sorts of things about the region and securing the region, even agriculture. And if you're interested in that, we do have those transcribed in one of our copies of Smithfield Review. I can tell you a little bit about that later. But I'm going to have Kenna talk about the two items that we're going to loan to the Taubman Museum of Art.
All right, so briefly at the very beginning, maybe let's try to get our light. It's a little challenging. Oh, perfect. Okay, so we have this invitation written from President Washington to Francis Smith Preston, excuse me, which was a son of William and Susanna, inviting him to a dinner at the White House on 26th of, in 1797. So this particular piece of paper is original. It was in George Washington's own hands, and it came here to Smithfield, inviting the Preston family members. Over here we have a snuff box, which is a very amazing piece. Oh, thank you. You can see the invitation a little more clearly. Over here we have a snuff box, rumored to be given from George Washington to William Preston as a thank you for saving his life at some point during the French and Indian War. And this piece is one of my favorite pieces in the collection. The fact that we can imagine this conversation between Washington and Preston and just a little token of gratitude is pretty amazing to think about. And it's a beautiful little box, but it sits in our museum so everyone who comes to Smithfield can interact with this object, same with the invitation.
And we're so excited that these are going to be at the Taubman so that a whole new audience will be able to interact with them. But one really interesting thing about this invitation is that Colonel William Preston died well before this invitation was sent out. He died in 1783, before the Treaty of Paris, before the end of the American Revolution. But Washington thought so highly of Colonel William and his children that he wanted to invite his son, Colonel William's son, to the executive mansion in Philadelphia, which is, I think, really, really profound. It says a lot about their relationship.
And up here above the fireplace, we have someone who we all might recognize. This particular portrait is not an original, but it is the earliest known copy of a portrait of George Washington. Martha Washington had this commissioned by Charles Willson Peale in 1772. So he's the same artist that commissioned or who painted the original photo that we saw at the very beginning of this presentation. Martha commissioned this as a companion piece to her 1757 portrait by John Woolston. And the original of this particular portrait hangs in the Virginia Military Institute. And it said that Martha had this commissioned so that they could hang side by side in their mansion.
And Kenna mentioned VMI. The Prestons were directly involved in founding the VMI. They were also directly involved, Colonel William Preston was involved in the founding of what became Washington League. Then it was called Liberty Hall. But the Prestons were involved in the founding of UVA because James Patton Preston was governor when UVA was established. And they've been involved with education all over the early United States and colonies, but they were also involved in politics. And over here, I have a copy of something that's called the Fincastle Resolutions. And the Fincastle Resolutions are something that a lot of people might not know about, but this was one of the earliest, very, very clear arguments for independence. And it basically says that all who signed this document, Colonel William Preston was one of them who signed this, they were subjects to the crown. They wanted to continue to be subjects to the crown, but if their liberties were infringed, they were willing to defend their liberties by forfeiting their lives. So this was written in early 1775. This influenced what became the Declaration of Independence authored by Thomas Jefferson. So the Prestons, I think, would have been very, very, very strongly connected to the early American government if Colonel William Preston did not die in 1783. Maybe there would have been a musical about him instead of Hamilton. I don't know. But a lot of people do say that this is probably the most important family that no one's ever heard of. And it's because of things like this, the Fincastle Resolution, starting institutions of higher learning, and opening up the West to settlement. And we're going to go upstairs to my office. I hope it's clean. It should be fairly decent.
Well, and as Ryan's heading up the stairs, if you have, we're going to head into the Q&A part of Curated Cribs. We had a wonderful tour in terms of really bringing to life the historic Smithfield Plantation. Thank you, Ryan and Kenna and Jessica. And now in an opportunity to ask questions. And I love how, you already posed questions for us to contemplate, not only on this call, but as we visit Smithfield Plantation, all related to, like you said, courage, leadership, and education. And so there is a chat function for those on the Curated Cribs. You can either write in there or you can unmute yourself and we'll open it up as well. We have a question that came in, Ryan, and from Yvonne. When was Preston governor of Virginia? What was that time frame?
Yeah, so James Patton Preston was governor of Virginia just after the War of 1812 until about 1820.
Mhm.
And we have copies of our more of our drink up here.
Well, and I have a question. You did mention that there was a number of correspondence between Preston and George Washington. Are those available for those that want to really dive deeper, especially as they come to the exhibition, see the, the works on view from George Washington about the battles, about, seeing that original Peel, but then, that introduction to Smithfield Plantation and Preston and that relationship, the really, that's that collaborative part here. Is there a place online? Is it, how do we get to dive deeper?
Well, the best way to go about it is to sign up for the Smithfield Review, which is a publication that Smithfield Preston Foundation puts together in collaboration with the history department at Virginia Tech. And in volume 18, we actually have transcriptions of each of those letters and a really thoughtful history of these letters and the relationship between Washington and Preston by one of the best historians of the area, the late Dr. Jim Bengal. So if you're interested in that, we do have that here, and we would be glad to sell that to you and mail it out to wherever you are. If you send us an email, we'd be glad to do that for you. But some of the letters do exist online. If you dig and search a little bit, you will be able to find them. We're hopeful that we will be able to post those on the Special Collections website for Virginia Tech at some point.
It also includes a very, very short description of Washington and Preston's relationship as they came down from Stanton to Buchanan and then throughout the rest of the region when Washington was on his tour of southwestern Virginia. So it has some dates and some things like that. Yes, the map that we saw. So it does describe a little bit of that as well, which is a very interesting piece. So check that out.
Mm-hmm.
Right, and we'll have that map, we'd love to share that in the exhibition too, so it really highlights that relationship along with the letters that you're talking about in the volume 18. We have another question that came in. Rupert, what is the history of the ownership of Smithfield? So how did that, that's a very interesting progression to know about.
Yes. So it was built in 1774. It remained a private homestead for the Preston family until about the 1930s. Once 1930s hit, there was a period there where it was leased to Virginia Tech, and they used it as a variety of different things. They used it as a place for tenant farmers, and so different tenant farmer families would live in each room of Smithfield. And then they also had the unique use of using it as a hay barn and a chicken coop, if you can believe that. The space that we just walked through had livestock in it. And then around the late 50s, Janie Preston Boulware Lamb, who is the great-great-granddaughter of William and Susanna, she was still an owner of the house. She had leased it out. And she came back to check on her property and was pretty dismayed to find the chickens and the hay and kind of the general disrepair that Smithfield had fallen into. So she was president of, a group called Association for Preservation of Virginia. And she was able to take Smithfield with that group's help and fundraising efforts and turn it into what we have today, which was a historic house museum. So the period of restoration went from 1960 to about 1964, and it opened as a museum in 1964. And we have remained so ever since. And 2020 was an interesting year for us, as everywhere, but we were able to see a lot of really great visitors. We had a lot of special events, so we are still encouraging people to come and interact with Smithfield just like they did when they first opened as a museum.
Well, and that's a great segue. You had a number of events that happened in December. You want to highlight a couple of those, as well as your hours coming up this weekend, as I understand, is an opportunity, if you haven't been to Smithfield Plantation, to head on out. It's not far from the Roanoke area.
So I can talk a little bit about the event real quick, and then I'll hand it over to Ryan for the hours. We had a really fun event last Sunday, called a Smithfield Yuletide. And that is an event that Smithfield staff had put on for many, many years. And it is a very traditional, normally, not in 2020, normally it's an indoor tea, a high tea with music in the drawing room, which was the first room with the fireplace around that we started in. And it's a really time-honored tradition for people in this area. People really enjoy it. With 2020's gathering restrictions and things like that, we moved everything outside, and we were able to still have the tea and scones and music components that people are used to, but we were able to add photographs with Santa. We were able to have demonstrations of spinning and blacksmith, and then the house was open for tours as well. And our interpreters, like Jessica was here, they were all costumed in period appropriate dress. So it was a kind of a step back into Smithfield. You may have seen the decorations as we walked through, evergreen boughs along each doorway, window boxes, things like that on the outside. Ryan and I had a lot of fun decorating the house last week.
And if you are interested in visiting Smithfield, we will be open for this coming Saturday and Sunday from 10 o'clock until 5 o'clock on Saturday, and then from 1 o'clock until 5 o'clock on Sunday. If you are interested in coming other times, Ken and I are very happy to host you. There is a spot on our website where you can sign up for an appointment for a private tour. We've had a number of those already as we've kind of curtailed our hours because of COVID. And we're really excited to host more people. It's really fun to have one-on-one connection as you go through the house.
Wonderful. Well, as we round out this hour, I see you have a number of things in front of you. Does that happen to be from your museum shop?
Yeah, we do have a number of items from our museum store. I mentioned the Mary Oak a little bit. This is an oak leaf. This is like a spoon holder made in our forge by our blacksmiths. That's available in our store. We also have an iron icicle that you can put on your Christmas tree. That's in our store as well, made on our forge. And we have J hooks and a number of things that our blacksmiths make.
Really quick, a note about that. We have had a lot of school groups come through recently. And when we have a blacksmith demonstration, they're always making hooks and things like that for the store specifically. So almost every time we have a group, we get a new hook. So we have all of this kinds of inventory coming in from people who are making it here at Smithfield, and every single one is different, which is really cool because it shows that it's handmade.
We're really trying to feature things that were made here at Smithfield or things similar to what would have been made here. I've got an urn or a small vase made out of a maple, an ancient maple that fell at Smithfield. And we have a number of these, and each one is unique. This one has a couple of little scars on it. We had somebody come and buy a number of these, but we have a few left. And if you are a history buff, and I assume some of you are, we have a number of books that I recommend. This one is the Prestons of Smithfield and Greenfield, same family. One of our board members wrote a great history on Blacksburg in the region here called the Blacksburg Drama. This goes into depth about the history of the region before Smithfield, during Smithfield, and really Smithfield's heyday comes to an end at the end of the Civil War, which really says a lot. And then the period after Smithfield and the emergence of Virginia Tech.
Wonderful. Well, thank you to Ryan, Spencer, and Kenna Jewell, and also your interpreter, Jessica, for sharing this evening with us and the virtual tour, which was just an opportunity to step into your space virtually and see each of the things and the questions, that courage, education, and leadership. And I know we look forward to visiting in person and also opening the exhibition together in that collaboration, which will be open, the Spotlight on George Washington in collaboration with Smithfield Plantation on view from January 17th as we go into the new year of 2021 and on view until the end of July. So that